There was a valley in the Swiss Alps, where the light arrived late and left early, where the mountains pressed close enough that a child could believe the world ended just beyond the next ridge, and in this valley, in a village called Borgonovo, a boy was learning to see his father see. The father was Giovanni Giacometti, a painter of some reputation in the post-impressionist mode, and he worked in a studio that smelled of linseed oil and turpentine. And the boy, Alberto, born in October of 1901, would watch him stand before a canvas, mixing colors on a palette, trying to capture the particular quality of alpine light as it moved across a meadow or caught the edge of a building. The father painted landscapes mostly, and portraits, and still lifes arranged on tables, and he painted with a certain gentleness, a softness of touch, that belonged to the 19th century even as the 20th was beginning to tear itself into new shapes elsewhere. Alberto was the eldest of 4 children. There was Diego, born 3 years after him, who would become his shadow and his anchor. There was Ottilia, and there was Bruno. They grew up in a house where art was not a special occasion, but the weather itself, the medium through which daily life was conducted. Their father painted. Their mother, Annetta, managed the household and the children, and maintained the kind of order that allowed a working artist to keep working. An uncle, Augusto, was also a painter. A cousin, Zaccaria, would become one. And so Alberto inherited not just a valley and a language and a nationality, but a way of being in the world that assumed the transformation of what you saw into something made by hand was as natural as breathing. He began drawing early. There are sketches from his childhood. Apples, chairs, his siblings, and they show a precocious attention to form, a desire to get things right, to make the marks on paper correspond to the shapes in space. At 9 years old, he made a drawing of a wooden chair in his father's studio, and the drawing is careful, earnest, the work of someone already worried about accuracy. At 10, he tried to sculpt. He took clay and tried to make a head, and the head did not look like a head, or it looked like a head, but not the one he was trying to make, and this gap between intention and result, this sense that what you saw and what you could render were separated by a distance you could never quite cross, this was already present. The valley was called Bergalia, and it ran along the border between Switzerland and Italy, a place of stone houses and narrow paths and the constant backdrop of peaks. In summer, the light was clean and sharp. In winter, the snow came early and stayed late. Alberto and Diego roamed the hillsides, played in the rivers, climbed the rocks. It was a childhood of a certain kind of freedom, bounded by geography, but open within those bounds. And yet for Alberto, there was always the question of what he was seeing. He would look at a tree and try to understand how far away it was, how its branches related to its trunk, how it occupied space. He would look at a person and try to measure the exact distance between their eyes, the precise shape of their nose, and the more he looked, the more unstable the image became. At 13, he made his first serious painting, a still life of apples arranged on a table, painted in his father's studio under his father's eye. The apples are round and solid, rendered with the kind of competence that suggests training. And yet even here there is something slightly off, a sense that the objects are not quite resting on the surface, that they are floating or sinking, that their relationship to the space around them is uncertain. When he was 14, the family went on a trip to Italy. They visited Venice, Florence, Rome. Alberto saw Tintoretto and Giotto and the ruins of the ancient world, and he was overwhelmed, not by the grandeur, but by the problem. How had these artists done it? How had they taken paint or stone and made something that felt like presence, like reality, like life? He copied paintings in museums. He filled sketchbooks. He came home more uncertain than when he left, because now he knew how much there was to know, how many centuries of knowledge stood between him and the thing he wanted to do. At school he was a decent student, but not exceptional. He was shy, or at least reserved. He read poetry, philosophy, whatever came his way. He had friends but kept a certain distance. What animated him was the work, the trying, the daily effort to make something with his hands. His father encouraged him but did not push. There was an understanding that Alberto would be an artist, because what else would he be? The question was not whether but how. In 1918, when he was 17, Alberto left the valley to attend the School of Fine Arts in Geneva. The First World War was ending, though Switzerland had remained neutral, and the world outside the mountains was reshaping itself in ways that would take decades to fully comprehend. In Geneva, Alberto studied drawing and painting and sculpture. He worked from plaster casts of classical statues. He drew from life. He learned anatomy, perspective, composition, the foundational grammar of representation, and he was good at it. His drawings from this period are confident, skilled, the work of someone who has mastered the basic language. But already he was dissatisfied. The problem, he felt, was not that he could not draw what he saw. The problem was that he could not see what he was supposed to draw. He would sit in front of a model and try to draw the model's head, and the head would seem to shrink as he looked at it, or expand, or shift in space, and the lines he put down on paper felt like lies, approximations, failures to capture the actual experience of seeing. He began to suspect that the entire enterprise of representational art was based on a convenient fiction, that objects had fixed dimensions, that space was stable, that you could measure a face and render it accurately if only you had enough skill. But what if skill was not the issue? What if the problem was that reality itself was unstable, that the act of looking changed what you saw, that distance and attention and time all conspired to make the world irreducibly strange? He stayed in Geneva for several years, working, learning, growing restless. In 1921, he made his first trip to Italy on his own, visiting Venice and Padua and Florence again, standing in front of paintings and sculptures and trying to understand their secret. He was particularly struck by the Egyptians. The rigid frontal figures in the museums, their massive solidity, their refusal to dissolve into space. There was something in their archaic stillness that felt truer than all the Renaissance naturalism, truer because it did not pretend to solve the problem of presence. An Egyptian statue did not try to be a body. It announced itself as a thing, a sign, an assertion. In 1922, he decided to go to Paris. He was 20 years old. Diego, who had also been studying art, came with him. The two brothers found a studio, a small cramped room in Montparnasse, on a narrow street called the Rue Hippolyte Mendron, and this studio, or rather the even smaller one they would move to on the same street a few years later, would become the site of everything that followed, the room where Alberto would spend the next 40 years of his life, working and destroying and working again. Paris in the 1920s was the center of the art world, or one of the centers, a city still recovering from the war, but alive with new ideas, new movements, new arguments about what art could be. Picasso was there. Braque, Matisse. The Surrealists were gathering, led by André Breton, making manifestos, staging provocations. Montparnasse was thick with studios and cafes, the Dôme, the Rotonde, the Coupole, where artists and writers and exiles from across Europe came to talk and drink and argue until morning. Alberto enrolled at the Académie de la Grande Chaumière, where he studied sculpture under Antoine Bourdelle, a former assistant to Rodin. Bourdelle taught a kind of heroic monumentalism, figures in dynamic poses, muscles tensed, drapery swirling. Alberto learned to model clay, to build armatures, to think about mass and volume and gesture. But again, he was unsatisfied. The classical approach felt dead to him, or at least irrelevant. He was not interested in heroism or drama or beauty. He was interested in the problem of what a figure was, how it stood in space, how it could be present without being decorative. He began to look at African art, oceanic art, the so-called primitive sculptures that Picasso and others had seized upon as a way out of the exhausted traditions of Europe. These objects, masks, fetishes, ancestral figures, had a directness, a strangeness, a refusal to conform to naturalistic proportions. They were not trying to copy the body. They were trying to summon something, to make a presence. Alberto started making sculptures that borrowed from this vocabulary: flat, schematic faces, simplified forms, a sense of the figure as sign rather than flesh. In 1925, he had his first minor success, a sculpted head of his mother, rendered with a rough, expressive surface, the features exaggerated, almost mask-like. It was exhibited in a small salon, and it was noticed. He began to meet other artists. He became friendly with André Masson, the painter, who introduced him to the Surrealist circle. By the late 1920s, Alberto was showing work in Surrealist exhibitions, making sculptures that leaned into dream logic and irrationality, objects that were half figure, half symbol, poised between representation and abstraction. One piece from this period is called Woman Head, Tree, made in 1927. It is a bronze of a female torso that also suggests a tree trunk, the forms merging, the boundaries between body and plant dissolved. Another, Reclining Woman Who Dreams, from 1929, is a flat, almost two-dimensional bronze of a female figure lying down abstracted to the point of resemblance to a leaf or a petal. These works were praised by the Surrealists. They fit the program, automatic, irrational, rejecting the tyranny of the visible world. But even as he made them, Alberto was uncertain. He was part of the group, attended the meetings, signed the manifestos, but he did not fully believe. The Surrealists wanted to bypass the eye, to tap into the unconscious, to liberate the image from the constraints of reality. Alberto wanted to see reality more clearly. The gulf between these aims was not yet unbridgeable, but it was there, a fault line that would eventually crack open. Diego, meanwhile, had become indispensable. He was quieter than Alberto, less driven by theory or ambition, but he had a gift for craft, for making things work. He built armatures, cast bronzes, repaired tools, kept the studio functional. He also modeled for Alberto, sitting for hours while his older brother studied his face, his hands, his posture. The two of them lived together, worked together, ate together. Diego was assistant, brother, collaborator, and subject. The relationship was close, almost wordless, built on routine and mutual dependence. In 1929, Alberto met a young woman named Flora Mayo, an American sculptor. They became lovers. Flora was independent, ambitious, restless. She had come to Paris to make art, and she and Alberto fell into a relationship that was intense and unstable. He made sculptures of her, heads, busts, figures, and in them you can see him trying to capture not just her features, but some quality of her presence, the way she held herself, the feeling of her being in the room. But the relationship was fraught. Flora wanted commitment, clarity. Alberto was elusive, consumed by his work, uncertain about everything except the need to keep working. They fought. They broke up. They reconciled. And then, in 1933, Flora left Paris and returned to the United States, and Alberto did not follow her, and that was the end of it. He was alone again, or alone except for Diego, and he returned to the problem that had been waiting for him all along: how to make a figure from life, how to render what he actually saw when he looked at a person sitting in front of him. In 1935, he did something that scandalized the Surrealists. He began working from the model again, not from imagination, not from dreams, but from direct observation. He hired models and had them sit in the studio, and he tried to sculpt their heads as he saw them. This was heresy. The Surrealists had rejected naturalism, rejected the academy, rejected the idea that art should be a mirror held up to the world. And here was Alberto, backsliding, returning to the most conservative practice imaginable. André Breton, the movement's pope, was furious. He saw Alberto's return to the model as a betrayal, a failure of nerve. In 1935, Breton expelled Alberto from the Surrealist group. The expulsion was theatrical, public, meant to be a repudiation. But Alberto did not care, or he did care, but not enough to change course. He had tried surrealism, had tried abstraction, had tried to liberate himself from the visible world, and none of it had satisfied him. What he wanted was simpler and harder. He wanted to make a sculpture of a head that looked like a head, that captured the exact distance and proportion and presence of a head as it appeared to his eye. And this turned out to be impossible. He worked for months on a single head, modeling it in clay, trying to get the proportions right, and the head would seem right for a moment and then wrong, and he would scrape it down and start again. The more he looked, the less he saw. The model's face, observed for hours, began to lose coherence. The eyes seemed too far apart or too close. The nose seemed too large or too small. The head itself seemed to shrink, to recede into space, until it was the size of a walnut, a pebble, a grain of sand. He filled notebooks with his observations. "The more I look," he wrote, "the less I see." He described how a face under sustained attention would collapse into a set of shifting relationships, none of them stable, all of them provisional. He compared the experience to falling, to drowning, to losing his grip on reality. And yet, he could not stop. The studio became a laboratory of failure. He would work all night, reducing a head to a tiny lump of clay no bigger than a thumb, convinced that this tiny lump was somehow more accurate than the life-size version he had started with. Then he would wake up and see that the tiny lump was also wrong, and he would start again. Diego watched all this with patience. He built new armatures. He sat as a model when Alberto needed one. He did not argue or judge. He simply stayed. The 30s were hard years. Europe was darkening. The economy was broken. Fascism was rising in Italy and Germany. Spain was at war. But in the studio on the Rue Hippolyte Maindron, time moved differently. The world's crises were distant, abstract. The only crisis that mattered was the one on the work table, this head, this figure, this impossible task of making the visible. Alberto lived simply. He had little money. He wore the same clothes for days. He ate irregularly, often at cheap cafes, or not at all. He smoked constantly. He drank coffee in great quantities. His studio was small, one room, barely large enough for a work table, a stool, a few shelves, and it was filthy, covered in dust and plaster and dried clay. He never cleaned it. He said the dirt was part of the process, that the studio had to be a place where things could accumulate, where nothing was ever really finished or thrown away. Visitors were struck by the chaos, the sense of a space that had been lived in without interruption for years, every surface marked by use, every corner filled with the residue of attempts. In 1938, he was hit by a car. He was crossing a street at night, and a car struck him, and he was thrown to the pavement, and his foot was crushed. He was taken to a hospital, treated, released. The foot healed badly. He would walk with a limp for the rest of his life. Later, he claimed that the accident had been important, even necessary. He said it had taught him something about vulnerability, about the fragility of the body, about the violence of the world's intrusion into the space of thought. Whether this was true or a story he told himself is hard to say, but the limp became part of his physical presence, a marker of damage, a sign that he had been marked by accident and survived. When the Second World War began in 1939, Alberto was in Switzerland, visiting his family. He stayed there through the war years, unable or unwilling to return to Paris while France was occupied. He lived in Geneva in small rented rooms, and he kept working. He sculpted heads, figures, always from life, always small. The scale kept shrinking. By 1941, his figures were the size of matchsticks. He could carry an entire year's work in a matchbox, and he did, moving it from place to place, terrified of losing it, though what he was carrying were objects so fragile and so reduced that they seemed on the verge of disappearing entirely. He was alone during these years, or mostly alone. Diego had stayed in Paris, working to protect the studio and the work that had been left behind. Alberto saw his family, made a few friends, but mostly he was isolated, working in small rooms, smoking, sketching, modeling tiny figures that seemed to be the end point of a long process of reduction. He was trying to find the minimum, the irreducible core of what a figure was. He would make a human form the size of a pin and feel that it was, in some way, more truthful than a life-size statue, because it acknowledged the distance between the viewer and the viewed. The way a person seen from across a room was small, compressed, barely there. He met a young woman named Annette Arm in Geneva. She was 20 years younger than Alberto. She worked in the Red Cross. She was serious, dutiful, patient. They met through mutual friends, and Alberto was drawn to her. He asked her to model for him, and she agreed. She came to his room and sat while he tried to draw her, to sculpt her, and the session stretched on for hours, days, weeks. Annette was not particularly interested in art, but she was interested in Alberto, or at least willing to endure his intensity, his strange rituals of looking and making. They became lovers. Alberto was possessive, demanding. He needed her to be there, to sit, to be seen. Annette complied, though the relationship was unequal, shaped by his need and her accommodation. When the war ended in 1945, Alberto returned to Paris, and Annette came with him. They moved into the studio on the Rue Hippolyte Maindron, that tiny, filthy room, and she began the life she would lead for the next 20 years, sitting for Alberto, managing his moods, tolerating his absences and his obsessions, becoming both muse and anchor. Paris after the war was a different city, scarred, exhausted, trying to rebuild not just buildings but meaning. The questions that preoccupied the pre-war avant-garde abstraction, automatism, the liberation of form, felt trivial now, or at least insufficient. The war had revealed something about human beings, about their capacity for violence and their vulnerability to annihilation, and art that did not reckon with this felt beside the point. Alberto returned to the studio and found that the work he had left behind, the surrealist objects, the early experiments, no longer interested him. What interested him was the work he had been doing in Geneva, the tiny figures, the attempt to capture the sheer fact of presence. He set up his table, hired models, and resumed. But something had shifted. The figures he made now were no longer shrinking. They were growing, but growing in a particular way, tall, thin, elongated. Their bodies stretched to the point of emaciation, their surfaces rough and corroded, as if they were being eaten away by the air around them. These figures, the ones that would define him, the ones that would become icons of post-war art, emerged in the late 1940s. They were not planned. They were the result of the same obsessive process he had been following for years, looking at a model, trying to render what he saw, finding that what he saw was not a solid, stable body, but something more fragile and uncertain, a presence that was always on the verge of dissolving. One of the first of these figures is called Man Pointing, made in 1947. It is a bronze, about 5 feet tall, of a male figure standing upright, one arm extended, the hand pointing towards something outside the frame. The figure is impossibly thin, the limbs like sticks, the torso narrow to almost nothing, the surface rough and textured, as if the bronze had been scratched and gouged. The head is small, perched atop a long neck, the features barely defined. And yet the figure is unmistakably human, unmistakably present. It stands. It points. It occupies space with a kind of fierce insistence, even as it seems to be wasting away. Another, City Square, also from 1947, is a bronze sculpture of 5 figures in an open plaza. The figures do not interact. They stand or walk in isolation, each one locked in their own space, their own trajectory. The plaza is featureless, just a flat surface, and the figures are thin and elongated, like the shadows of people rather than people themselves. The piece suggests loneliness, disconnection, the atomization of urban life. But it also suggests endurance, the stubborn fact of being there, of continuing to move through space even when connection is impossible. These works were noticed. They were exhibited in Paris and then in New York, and critics and philosophers began to write about them. Jean-Paul Sartre, the existentialist philosopher, visited Alberto's studio and saw in the sculptures a visual analog to his own ideas. Sartre wrote an essay about Alberto, describing the figures as embodiments of existential solitude, beings thrown into a world that offered no inherent meaning, forced to create their own presence through sheer assertion. The essay was published in 1948 and became one of the most famous pieces of art criticism of the century. It linked Alberto's work to a broader intellectual movement, to the post-war reckoning with absurdity and freedom and the void. Alberto was ambivalent about this. He liked Sartre, respected him, but he did not think of himself as an existentialist. He thought of himself as someone trying to solve a problem of perception, not philosophy. But the association stuck. The figures became symbols of alienation, of anxiety, of the human condition in the atomic age. They appeared in magazines, in books, in museums. They were reproduced, written about, theorized. And Alberto, who had spent years working in obscurity, suddenly found himself famous. Fame did not change the work. He kept the same studio, the same routines. He woke late, often in the afternoon. He drank coffee, smoked, looked at whatever he had been working on the night before, decided it was wrong, and started again. He worked at night, mostly, to the small hours, alone except for Diego, who was always there, building armatures, preparing plaster, casting bronzes, doing the labor that allowed Alberto to keep making. Diego never complained. He never asked for recognition or credit. He was content, or seemed content, to be the assistant, the shadow, the necessary other. And Alberto relied on him absolutely. He used Diego as a model more than anyone else, sculpting his head and his figure hundreds of times over the decades. There are bronze busts of Diego from every year, every period, and they form a kind of record, not just of Diego's aging, but of Alberto's seeing. The endless variations on a single familiar face. Annette also sat, though less often. Alberto painted her and drew her and sculpted her, but the sessions were difficult. He would work for hours, reducing her face to a few lines, a few marks, and then he would grow frustrated and erase everything and start again. Annette endured this with remarkable patience, but it was not easy. She was often alone, waiting for Alberto to finish, to come home, to pay attention to her as a person rather than as a subject. The marriage they married in 1949 was not happy in any conventional sense. It was a marriage built on need and habit and the strange, consuming logic of the work. In 1950, Alberto made The Chariot, a bronze sculpture of a standing female figure on a wheeled platform. The figure is elongated, thin, her arms at her sides, her face a rough mask. The chariot is an ancient form, something from Egypt or Mesopotamia, and the piece has an archaic, ritualistic quality, as if the figure were not a person but a deity, a presence summoned from another time. The piece was included in the Venice Biennale, where it was received as a major statement, a synthesis of Alberto's concerns with presence, distance, and the problem of the figure in space. He was now one of the most important artists in the world. His work was shown in major galleries and museums. Collectors sought him out. Prices for his sculptures began to rise, and yet he remained in the same tiny studio, working under the same conditions, tormented by the same doubts. He began to paint more in the 1950s, often working from the same models he sculpted. His paintings are strange, compulsive objects. They are mostly portraits, Annette, Diego, other friends, and they are built up over long sessions, layer after layer of paint applied and scraped away and reapplied, until the surface is thick and encrusted, a palimpsest of attempts. The faces in these paintings are never quite in focus. They seem to hover, to recede, to resist clarity. The brushwork is nervous, agitated, a dense web of lines and marks that barely cohere into an image. One painting, Annette in the Studio, from 1954, shows Annette sitting in a chair, her figure small and distant, surrounded by a vast field of gray. The studio is rendered as an empty space, and Annette is almost lost in it, a tiny presence dwarfed by the architecture of seeing. The painting is not a portrait in the traditional sense. It is a record of distance, of the gap between the painter and the painted, and of the way that gap can never be closed. Alberto also returned to sculpture, making more of the standing and walking figures that had become his signature. Walking Man I, made in 1960, is one of the most iconic. It is a life-size bronze of a male figure mid-stride, the right leg forward, the left behind, the arms at the sides. The figure is thin, elongated, the surface rough and pitted. The head is small, tilted slightly forward, the features eroded. The figure is not hurrying, not fleeing. It is simply walking, moving through space, with a kind of existential determination, the act of walking reduced to its essential geometry. The sculpture is remarkable for its poise. Despite the attenuation, the figure is balanced, stable. It does not topple or collapse. It walks, and in that walking there is something almost triumphant, a refusal to be defeated by the erosion of form, by the void pressing in on all sides. Walking Man was cast in an edition of 6, and over the years the casts have been acquired by museums and collectors around the world. In 2010, one of them was sold at auction for over $100 million, then the highest price ever paid for a sculpture. The sale made headlines, and Alberto's name was once again in the news, though he had been dead for more than 40 years by then. The price was absurd, a symptom of a distorted art market, but it was also a measure of the work's endurance, its ability to carry meaning across decades, to remain a presence. But that auction was far in the future. In the 1950s, Alberto was still working, still struggling, still convinced that he had not yet made the thing he was trying to make. He destroyed more than he finished. He would work on a sculpture for months, and then, dissatisfied, smash it or scrape it down to nothing and start over. He said he was always failing, that every piece was a failure, that the perfect rendering of what he saw was always just beyond his reach. And yet he kept working, because what else was there to do? He had a circle of friends, artists, writers, philosophers. He knew Samuel Beckett, the Irish playwright, and the two of them had a certain affinity. Beckett's plays, spare, absurd, filled with solitary figures waiting or speaking into the void, had a visual and emotional kinship with Alberto's sculptures. Waiting for Godot, Beckett's most famous play, premiered in 1953, around the same time Alberto was making his most iconic figures, and the resemblance is not coincidental. Both men were working through the same post-war questions. How do you represent a human being when the old certainties have collapsed? How do you make presence felt when presence itself is precarious? Beckett asked Alberto to design a set for a play, and Alberto agreed, though the project never came to fruition. But they remained friends, drinking together in cafes, talking late into the night about art and failure and the impossibility of saying anything true. Alberto also knew Albert Camus, another existentialist, though Camus and Sartre eventually had a falling out, and Alberto was careful not to take sides. He knew Francis Bacon, the British painter, whose screaming, distorted figures had their own kind of existential charge. He knew Balthus, the enigmatic painter of unsettling interiors. He was part of a milieu, a post-war Parisian art world that was trying to rebuild meaning from the rubble, and yet he was also solitary. He worked alone, he thought alone. The friendships were real, but they were not the center of his life. The center was the studio, the table, the figures taking shape under his hands. In 1956, he had a major retrospective at the Arts Council in London. The show was a success, critically and publicly. People lined up to see the strange, elongated figures, the rough, eroded surfaces. The British press wrote about him as a major figure, a sculptor whose work spoke to the anxieties of the age. But Alberto was uncomfortable with the attention. He did not like being interviewed, did not like explaining the work. He felt that the work should speak for itself, and if it did not, then it had failed. He also began to have health problems. The years of smoking, of irregular meals, of working through the night, had taken a toll. He had trouble with his lungs, his digestion. He ignored these problems or downplayed them, unwilling to let illness interfere with the work. In the late 1950s, he met a young woman named Caroline, a prostitute who worked in Montparnasse. He became obsessed with her. She became his model and his lover, though the relationship was transactional, built on money and need rather than affection. Alberto was entranced by her face, her presence, and he painted and drew her compulsively, filling notebooks with sketches, covering canvases with her image. Annette knew about Caroline and was hurt, but she did not leave. She stayed in the studio, stayed in the marriage, enduring the humiliation because leaving would have meant abandoning the life she had built, the role she had inhabited for so long. The paintings of Caroline are different from the ones of Annette or Diego. They are more sensual, more alive, though still marked by the same compulsive layering of paint, the same inability to settle on a final image. Caroline's face appears again and again, sometimes recognizable, sometimes dissolving into a mass of marks. Alberto was not interested in her as a person, or not primarily. He was interested in her as a problem, a visual puzzle, another opportunity to try and fail and try again. In 1962, he had another major retrospective, this time at the Kunsthaus Zurich in Switzerland. The show included sculptures, paintings, and drawings from across his career, and it was seen as a summation, a chance to take stock of what he had accomplished. The catalog essay praised him as one of the great artists of the century, a sculptor who had reinvented the human figure for a new age. Alberto attended the opening but was restless, uncomfortable with the praise, eager to get back to Paris and resume work. He also began to receive official recognition. In 1961, he was awarded the Guggenheim International Award for Painting. In 1965, he won the grand prize for sculpture at the Venice Biennale, though he had already won it once before. These honors meant little to him. He accepted them, attended the ceremonies when he had to, but he did not change his life or his work in response. The only thing that mattered was whether the next sculpture, the next painting, would solve the problem he had been working on for 40 years. By the mid-1960s, his health was failing. He had developed stomach cancer, though he did not know it or did not acknowledge it. He kept working, kept smoking, kept ignoring the signs. In December of 1965, he traveled to Switzerland for a medical examination, and the doctors found the cancer advanced and inoperable. He was admitted to a hospital in Chur, near the valley where he had grown up. He died on January 11, 1966. He was 64 years old. Diego and Annette were with him. His last words, according to those who were there, were about the work, about something he had been trying to do, some problem he had not yet solved. He was buried in the family plot in Borgonovo, the village in the valley where he had been born. The grave is simple, marked by a stone, and nearby is a small cemetery where other members of the Giacometti family are buried, including his father, his mother, his brother Bruno. The valley had been the beginning, and it was the end. After his death, the work continued to circulate, to be exhibited, to be written about. The retrospectives multiplied. The prices at auction climbed. The figures appeared in textbooks, in museums, in films. They became shorthand for a certain kind of post-war sensibility, for existential solitude, for the fragility of presence. And the more they were reproduced and circulated, the more they seemed to confirm what Alberto had always feared, that the work could never be finished, that every attempt was provisional, that the gap between what he saw and what he made was unbridgeable. But there is something else in the work, something that resists the neat categories of existentialism and anxiety. There is endurance. The figures stand. They walk, they point. They are eroded, corroded, barely there, and yet they are there. They refuse to disappear. They insist on their presence even as they acknowledge their fragility. And this double quality, presence and absence, solidity and dissolution, is what gives them their power. Diego continued to live in the studio after Alberto's death. He managed the estate, oversaw the casting of bronzes, kept the space more or less as it had been. He died in 1985, and after his death, the studio was dismantled and reconstructed at the Institut Giacometti in Paris, where it stands now as a kind of shrine, a record of the life lived there. Annette outlived both of them. She remained in Paris, managing her portion of Alberto's estate, selling works when she needed money, giving interviews when asked. She died in 1993. She's buried in Paris, not in the valley, separate even in death. The question of what Alberto was trying to do, of what the work is about, has been debated for decades. Some see it as a record of vision, an attempt to render the literal experience of seeing. Others see it as symbolic, as a commentary on the human condition, on alienation, on loss. Still others see it as formal, as an exploration of space and mass and proportion. All of these readings are true, and none of them are sufficient. The work exceeds interpretation. It sits in museums and galleries around the world, and people stand in front of it and feel something: recognition, unease, sadness, awe. The figures are small and large, frail and strong, present and absent. They are like us and not like us. They are what remains when everything else has been stripped away. There's a photograph of Alberto in the studio, taken sometime in the 1950s. He is standing at his work table, a cigarette in one hand, a sculpture in front of him. The sculpture is a standing figure, thin and elongated, and Alberto is looking at it with a kind of fierce concentration, as if he is trying to see something in it that is not yet visible. The studio is a mess, plaster dust on the floor, tools scattered on the table, old armatures leaning against the wall. The light is dim. Alberto's face is lined, tired, intent. He looks like a man who has been working for hours and will work for hours more, who will keep working until he gets it right, though he knows he will never get it right, that the thing he is trying to see will always recede, always elude him. And yet he keeps looking, he keeps making. The work continues. In the years after his death, the market for his work exploded. The bronzes, the paintings, the drawings, everything was sought after, catalogued, authenticated, sold. The studio became a tourist site. The biography became a legend. The obsessive artist, the tiny studio, the endless failures, the late success. It is a story that fits a certain narrative about art, about the solitary genius laboring in obscurity, misunderstood by his time, vindicated by history. But the story is more complicated than that. Alberto was not misunderstood. He was recognized, celebrated, written about, exhibited. He won prizes, sold work, had retrospectives. The failure he spoke of was not commercial or critical. It was internal, metaphysical. It was the failure to close the gap between intention and result, between what he wanted to make and what he was able to make. And this failure was not a flaw in the work. It was the work. The figures are what they are because they embody that failure, that impossibility, that endless, doomed attempt to capture something that cannot be captured. There is a late painting, made in 1964, called Diego in a Plaid Shirt. It shows Diego sitting in the studio wearing a checkered shirt, his face rendered in Alberto's characteristic manner, a dense web of lines and marks, the features barely emerging from the surface. The painting is small, maybe 18 inches tall, and it is encrusted with paint layer upon layer, the product of many sessions, many attempts. Diego's face is there and not there, present and dissolving. The background is a murky gray, and Diego seems to float in it, unanchored, suspended. The painting is not beautiful in any conventional sense. It is anxious, compulsive, almost ugly. But it is also deeply moving, because it is so obviously an act of love. Alberto painted Diego hundreds of times over 50 years, and every painting was an attempt to see him, to know him, to render the fact of his presence. And every painting failed, in the sense that it could not make Diego fully visible, could not close the distance between the painter and the painted. But the failure is also the record of the effort, the proof that the attempt was made, again and again, despite the impossibility. This is what the work is, a record of effort, of looking, of trying to make the invisible visible. It is not about success. It is about the process, the labor, the daily confrontation with the gap between what you see and what you can make. In 2015, the Fondation Giacometti opened in Paris, dedicated to preserving and exhibiting his work. The building includes a reconstruction of the studio, complete with the work table, the tools, the dust. Visitors can walk through it, can see the space where the figures were made, can imagine the nights Alberto spent there, smoking, sculpting, starting over. But the studio, like the figures, is a reconstruction. The original is gone. The space has been cleaned, lit, made presentable. It is no longer the chaotic, filthy room where Alberto lived and worked. It is a museum, a monument. And there is something melancholy about this, the way the life becomes an exhibit, the way the work that was made in private, in obsession, in failure, is now displayed in public, explained, celebrated. But this is what happens. The artist dies. The work remains. The work is sold, exhibited, written about, loved, misunderstood, reproduced. It enters the world and becomes part of the world's conversation with itself. And in the process, it changes. It is no longer just the thing the artist made. It is also what people see in it, what they bring to it, what they need it to be. Alberto would have hated this, or at least resisted it. He did not want the work to be finished, to be fixed. He wanted it to remain open, provisional, a question rather than an answer. But the work, once made, has its own life. It escapes the artist's control. It becomes something else, something more and less than what was intended. There is a sculpture made in 1960 called Three Men Walking. It is a bronze of three elongated figures, each one striding forward, arms at their sides, legs in motion. The figures are identical, or nearly so, and they move in the same direction, but they do not touch, do not acknowledge each other. They are alone together, separate even as they share the same space, the same trajectory. The sculpture is often read as an image of modern alienation, the loneliness of the crowd, the isolation of urban life. And it is that. But it is also something simpler and stranger. It is three figures walking. It is the act of walking, repeated, multiplied, made visible. It is the most ordinary thing in the world, putting one foot in front of the other, moving through space, and the sculpture makes that act monumental, archetypal, almost sacred. This is what Alberto did, over and over. He took the most basic facts of existence, standing, walking, sitting, looking, and made them visible in a new way. He stripped away the decorative, the incidental, the comforting, and left only the essential. And the essential turned out to be fragile, eroded, uncertain. But it was there. It persisted. It refused to vanish. In the end, the work is not about philosophy or psychology or history, though it touches on all of these. It is about presence. It is about the fact of being here, of occupying space, of being seen and seeing. It is about the distance between people and the effort to bridge that distance and the failure of that effort. and the beauty of the failure. There is a late drawing made in 1965, the last year of his life. It is a pencil sketch of Diego's face, rendered in a few quick lines. The drawing is small, maybe 6 inches square, and it is barely there. A few marks on paper, the suggestion of a face rather than a face itself. But the lines are alive, nervous, searching. They do not settle into a fixed image. They remain open, provisional, a question. This is the last image, or one of the last. A face, barely visible, a presence, barely there. The act of looking, never finished, never resolved. And then the looking stops. The hand stops. The artist dies. The work remains. What remains is not a body of masterpieces, though there are masterpieces. What remains is a record of struggle, of the daily confrontation with the impossibility of making. The figures stand in museums, in private collections, in public squares. They are reproduced in books, on posters, in documentaries. They have become icons, symbols, brands. But underneath all that, they are still what they were when Alberto made them, attempts. Provisional, fragile, uncertain attempts to make visible something that resists visibility. The studio on the Rue Hippolyte Mendron was torn down in the 1980s. The building was demolished, replaced by something new. The space where Alberto spent 40 years of his life, where he made the figures and the paintings and the drawings, where he smoked and drank coffee and worked through the night, that space no longer exists. But the work exists. The figures exist. They stand, they walk, they point. They are here and they are not here. They are present and they are dissolving. They are what he saw and what he could not see. They are the gap and they are the bridge. They are the failure and they are the triumph. They are what remains when everything else has been stripped away. And maybe that is enough. Maybe that is enough. Maybe that is all we can ask. That something remains, that the effort was made, that the looking continues even after the looker is gone. There are now exhibitions of his work every year somewhere in the world. Museums mount retrospectives. Scholars publish new studies. Collectors compete for the bronzes. The prices climb. The legend grows. But none of this changes the work. The work is what it is. It stands outside of time, or at least outside of the time of markets and fashions and reputations. It is rooted in a different time, the time of making, the slow, obsessive, repetitive time of the studio, where hours collapse into minutes and minutes stretch into years, where the only measure is the distance between what you see and what you make. And that distance is always the same. It never closes. It is the essential fact, the condition of the work. Alberto spent his life trying to close it, and he failed, and the failure is the work. The figures are thin because that is how far they are. They are eroded because that is what happens when you look long enough. They are fragile because that is what we are, and they are there, standing, walking, pointing, because that is what we do. We persist. We continue. We refuse to disappear, even when disappearing seems inevitable. This is the legacy. Not the prices, not the retrospectives, not the scholarship. The legacy is the figures themselves, standing in museums and galleries and public spaces, silent and insistent, demanding nothing, offering nothing, simply there. They are among us, and they are not among us. They are what we see when we look at each other across the unbridgeable distance of being separate people in separate bodies in separate lives. They are the image of that distance, and they are the image of the effort to cross it, and they are the image of the failure, and they are the image of the refusal to give up. And so they remain, thin, eroded, barely there, walking, standing, pointing, present and dissolving, here and not here. The work of a man who could not finish, who could not stop, who could not see what he was looking for, but kept looking anyway, night after night, year after year, until the looking stopped and the work was all that was left, standing in the space between what we are and what we cannot be, marking the distance, bearing witness, refusing to vanish.